It was Monday, April 23rd, 2018, almost 5 years ago. There was just this electric buzz in the air. And in Sacramento County, the EAR means one thing and one thing only: the East Area Rapist.
I had no idea of the East Area Rapist. I didn't know that there was any rapes or break-ins or anything at that time. My parents were very closed-lipped, didn't share a lot. And I think, it's back in that culture where if we don't talk about it, it doesn't happen.
There was a whole task force made up of, DAs and law enforcement up and down the state of California. And the decision was made to utilize a new form of investigation, genetic genealogy.
The power of this tool is remarkable. It's, we have this great DNA database called CODIS, which has been huge. 30 to 40% of crimes with DNA across this country can get solved with CODIS. It's pretty impressive.
Investigative genetic genealogy was when they started zeroing in and building the family tree and started zeroing in on him as a suspect. It was actually an investigative assistant in my office, Monica Jakowski, who still works here, and she works in our code case unit.
Walking into Monica's office during this time frame when they were working on this case, at one point I said, "Is this going to work?" And she looked up and she said, "It's the greatest hope we have."
As you're going through the list of possible suspects, hundreds, thousands of them, as you go through them, Monica was the one that zeroed in and says, "I think this might be it." And he fit the profile. Ex-law enforcement, ex-military, lived in Rancho Cordova, grew up in the area, had ties to Southern California. So we started piecing together. He even had ties down to Tulare County because of the first murder that occurred in the series.
Look at those of us that grew up in Sacramento that were not, quote, victims. We changed our lives. I mean, I grew up right down the street from here, about a mile down the street. And my mom had an ice pick under her pillow. I didn't know that. I mean, we had to be home before dark. All those things that everyone has their own story.
Okay, I'm still a single parent. I still have bells on my doors and a bat by my bed because I'm gonna still be ready. It prepared me to be ready.
I'd wake up in the middle of the night, almost like in a fever dream, dreaming about the case, dreaming about, making sure that the windows were locked, the doors were locked. I mean, it was so vivid, so terrifying, what he had done and the terror that he gripped the Sacramento community.
Before it happened, like the day before and years before that, right? I'm 100% me, Chris. The day after it happened, I was 100% a victim. And I didn't know what that meant. I knew I wasn't a child anymore, but I certainly was in no way prepared to be an adult. So I was kind of confused and lost. To make things more confusing, I was told by my father to never ever talk about it, and that was not an ask. That was a demand. And me and my sister and my parents, we never spoke about it.
And it wasn't just Sacramento. I mean, you get to learn the Sacramento cases, but then you begin to then learn about the cases down in Santa Barbara, in Ventura County, in Orange County, in Tulare County. The rapes that occurred, for example, in San Joaquin, in Stanislaus, in Santa Clara, in Alameda, in Contra Costa. I mean, it's just the litany, 11 different jurisdictions up and down the state of California over a 16-year time span as far as we know.
I couldn't think about him being out there. I couldn't think about either he was in prison or he was dead. And that is how I managed to not be fearful.
Well, your father and your stepmother were killed by a serial killer. And then I sat down because I knew, I'm like, but that's like 0.01% of all murders. That's not possible. And DNA had just kind of started. And he said, we have connected your case to another group in Southern California, the Orange County Cold Case Group. That was a game changer for me because I had to rethink everything I had thought for 20 years.
One of the dilemmas that we had was the statute of limitation had run essentially on a number of the cases because the laws were written. And so a lot of the sex offenses, the statute of limitation had run. Way to look at those cases that we were able to charge was they were aggravated kidnapping, which was a life offense.
Because it didn't take away that he didn't do it. He just, escaped the statute. but he still ruined so many lives. And I got a call from Carol Daly and told me that he had been caught. And for me, right, I thought he was dead. So this was a real blast for me. It's like, wow. Like I went into shock. The shock I should have gone into right after he was caught. And that was the day the healing began. But it was a really rough, it was a rough start.
The difference between me and like Chris is a 16-year-old and she's feeling him on her body. Like I don't have that. So for me, he's always been an abstract person anyway.
Because everything that I had said in my life, that this man, or sometimes I even said this didn't even happen. I remember with my husband, I'd say, you know what, I don't even know if this happened. Because it was just so distant from me. Because I had used so many years of not talking about it. And he would say, yeah, it really did happen.
And when he came out, I think we both kind of caught our breath because he was just an old man. You build up a monster in your head. You think whoever does this, he has to be a monster, right? And he is. He's still a monster.
He wasn't the man he tried to portray himself to be in a courtroom. He's definitely very much the same man that he was when he was committing these crimes.
And it was the most anxious time, just waiting. What door is he going to come through? When is he going to come through? And then he came through in a wheelchair.
And I would see him in his cell doing jumping jacks. I would see him in his cell climbing up and down. I would see him in his cell do all these moves and these exercises, etc. in there. All of it. And then I'd see him come to court. And he'd be in a wheelchair, acting as if he was an invalid, acting as if he didn't know what was going on, that he could barely move, that he could barely say anything. It was all an act. Joseph DeAngelo is a master manipulator. I've said this before. The fact that he was a police officer, the badge in the uniform was a mask. Him being a retired mechanic living in Citrus Heights, that was a mask. Him being a family man, that was a mask. He wore a mask during his crimes, constantly wearing a mask. And when he went to court in his wheelchair, acting the way he did, that was a mask. That was part of his game of manipulation and malingering.
I never actually had a reaction to his face, and I think it's probably because he was behind a mask. As he got thinner and looked meaner, and then we saw all the games he was playing, like you really could see who this person was, who could change, on a dime.
Incredibly satisfied with the way it turned out because we got something that never happens. This, and it's been underplayed, but it's actually such a big deal. DeAngelo admitted to crimes that he was not charged with. And I think this, that's the part of the story that should have been the headlines. Not that he was convicted of the ones that he was guilty of that we had DNA for, but he admitted to the ones we couldn't try because of the statute of limitations. And if you were hanging out with the people I was hanging out, who were the survivors, that was everything to them.
It was really another surreal moment when we did attended the plea hearing. We weren't expecting them to go through almost every detail of our assaults. And that day, though, was actually really special. We wanted to have our names known, many of us. And they said no, to protect privacy. Like, there's so many victims, maybe they didn't want to accidentally say a name and not. Well, for us, I'll say me, and there were a few others, we were finally ready to talk about it. We were finally ready to say, this is not our shame. We stand here. We are your neighbors. We're your coworkers. We are not that person that lives in, some part of the town that nobody knows, because that's how we feel safe, right? It doesn't happen in my neighborhood. And we really wanted to stand up.
It was huge for me, really emotional, because I realized I could talk to somebody who survived this guy. I realized there were a group of people out there that finally understood what this man had done.
I really wanted to know what was behind his choosing who he chose or why he did what he did, and he'll just be stone silent. But I think the hearings mostly gave me exposure to other victims. And through that exposure, we all became united. Togetherness and kind of family feel, that it really took the sting away from the arraignment. We were all going through it together. Whether we were charged or were we uncharged, we all took vow of what I know, you will know.
I didn't put these stats together, but I know they're accurate. 43 years, 650 investigators, 15 different law enforcement agencies, somewhere about $10 million, 10,000 people of interest, 300 people swab for DNA, and 0 people came up on that list. And then this genealogy tool comes along. 5 people on that genealogy team. Couple $100, a little more expensive now, but a couple $100. And it was solved in 63 days. It's pretty remarkable. And that's, without getting into too much of these other cases, some of these cases, 15 years of an investigation, and the answer comes to them like within an hour, 2 hours. It's like, oh my God.
He's still DNA guilty. And that was really comforting, because that wasn't going to be based on building a typical case. It just meant if we found him, it was over. And DNA guilty was a huge comfort for me.
Cold cases, and we're talking about murders, we're talking about rape, child murders, child molestation, cases that have been solved across the country using investigative genetic genealogy. So this is a powerful tool that can use in terms of holding the right person responsible, but also at the same time exonerating the innocents. Making sure that justice is done, because if you are convicting somebody who is innocent and didn't commit that crime, if you look at it, then somebody who committed the crime got away with it. So we need to make sure that we exonerate those who are innocent and then go after those who committed these crimes. And it's a wonderful tool.
This case has, it was the shot across the bow in terms of our ability now to not only solve more crime, but obviously exonerate people and identify remains.
Are there any other victims? Do you think he stopped in 1986 with the murder and rape of Janelle Cruz? Do you think that he stopped? The question is, why do you think he stopped in 1986? And when people ask me that question, what I always say is, what makes you think he stopped in 1986? That's the first thing. But in regards to why he did what he did, how a monster is created. How a monster is created. And the question is a valid question, is the one that everybody wants to know. And I'll say this, I simply don't know.
I think he sees himself very differently than how we see him. And that's the criminal guy, that guy who could leap fences and fool the police and be tricky and, take things and all those things that he kind of romanticized and made magical in his myth that he built around himself. And I suspect it's the same even now, that it's the same myth he tells himself